Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us in cyberspace this evening. I'm Marcy Shore. I'm a professor of history at Yale, as well as a regular visiting fellow at the Institute für die Wissenschaften von Menschen in Vienna, which is where I'm coming to you from tonight. I want to thank you for coming at the last minute and thank all my colleagues and panelists for coming at the last minute. This was a very spontaneous event. As I'm sure all of you who have tuned in know, 2 days ago, a Ryanair flight on its way from Athens to Vilnius was in effect spontaneously hijacked by the Belarusians, forced to land in Minsk. And at that point, a young 26-year-old journalist and his 23-year-old student girlfriend were abducted and arrested. This, even by the standards of scandalous things and unimaginable things that are happening in today's day and age, was somewhat particularly outrageous. And I thought it was important that we have a conversation immediately. So I'm very grateful to my colleagues for coming. I'm going to introduce them very briefly so we can get right to their comments. Martin Malek is an Austrian political scientist. Sławomir Sierakowski is the founder and editor-in-chief of Krytyka Polityczna in Poland. Viktoras Bachmetjevas is a professor of philosophy at Vytautas Magnus University in Kaunas, Lithuania, and a current visiting fellow at the Institute für die Wissenschaften von Menschen. François Helsbourg is senior advisor for Europe for the IISS, as well as special advisor for the Paris-based Foundation for Strategic Research. Fiona Hill is a Bosch senior fellow at the Center on the United States and Europe, Foreign Policy, and the Brookings Institution. And Ivan Krastev is a permanent fellow at the Institute für die Wissenschaften von Menschen here in Vienna. Thank you all very much for coming. I wish it were under happier circumstances, but we have what we have. And Timothy Snyder, who is also a professor of history at Yale and a permanent fellow at the Institute für die Wissenschaften von Menschen, is going to moderate. So I will turn it right over to them.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much again to all of our panelists for joining us on short notice. I'm very glad that we've assembled a group with expertise that ranges from the philosophical to the strategic, and in a group which in one way or another has expertise which is directly relevant to this perplexing and disturbing turn of events. It's our hope that in the next 60 minutes, we'll be able to bring some clarity to this. And when I say we, I mean before all the panelists. So as a chair, it's my job to give them voice. We're going to have a brief discussion where each panelist will speak. Then we will have a more informal discussion, and I will try to work in some of your questions as we do so. So if you have questions, please just leave them on the general chat, and I will try to pick them up and work them in. So Martin, Malek, I'd like to begin with you. Before we move to the surprising events of May 23rd, I thought it would be helpful if we could have a few minutes of background about the Lukashenko regime. If you could remind us of some of the things which might make this turn of events a little bit less surprising, or just in general, some of the things that we ought to know about the Lukashenko regime, I'd be very appreciative. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Timothy. First of all, hi everyone, and thank you for inviting me to this very distinguished group of experts and academics. Well, we all know what happened 2 days ago in the Belarusian airspace. This is a totally, as far as I remember, unique case of very unusual hijacking of an airplane. Usually some pirates do that who are inside the aircraft, but in this particular case it was conducted from the outside. But a lot of commentators in politics, in the media, in academic circles have voiced some kind of surprise. They said that this is very, very unusual, strange. We had never had that before. So this is, of course, all true. But from my point of view, one cannot be totally surprised if we keep in mind the features, the character of the Lukashenko regime, because this would help us to understand what it is capable doing of. I want to remind you that Mr. Lukashenko was elected president of Belarus on the basis of a then newly enacted democratically doubtless constitution of Belarus, the first post-Soviet Belarusian constitution in '94. This means that he is in power for 27 years. I think in Europe only Queen Elizabeth is long ahead of state. In the second place, if I am not mistaken, is already Mr. Lukashenko. And in this 27 years happened a lot, which had largely been forgotten in the European Union and in Northern America, or which never had really entered the, so to speak, collective conscious of the public and of the political sphere. I want to remind you an incident which happened in September 1995, when an attack helicopter of the Belarusian Air Force shot down a balloon that had taken part in a gas balloon race and had entered Belarusian airspace completely unintentionally. The advantage, so to speak, from Lukashenko's specific point of view was that both balloonists killed were citizens of the United States, a country he vehemently dislikes. And official Belarus has never apologized or offered compensation for the death, and in the European Union and North America, no one was interested in this incident at all. Then Lukashenko's regime became increasingly authoritarian. Unfortunately, we have no time to go into details and to recall all the details with the several referendums Lukashenko had conducted in order to create some imagination of a democratic legitimation, which in effect was very questionable. I only want to recall that Mr. Lukashenko in '96 pushed through big amendments to the Belarusian constitution, which gave him much more power. In the fall of '96, from Lukashenko's point of view, of course, unreliable, so to speak, unicameral parliament, the Supreme Soviet, was just dissolved and replaced by Lukashenko again with a bicameral parliament in which, with very, very few exceptions, only his supporters have been represented since the end of '96. I mean, for 25 years now. The opposition is almost not represented in the Belarusian parliament at all. In '99, several opposition politicians, including a former interior minister, General Yuri Sakharenko, and the former deputy prime minister Viktor Gonchak, or Hanchar in Belarusian language, died under unexplained circumstances. However, there are numerous indications that Lukashenko ordered or at least approved their assassination. And in the second half of the 1990s, when Russian President Boris Yeltsin in Moscow was increasingly weak politically and in terms of health, Lukashenko dreamed about becoming the president of a new so-called union state by uniting his country, Belarus, with Russia. However, this came to an end in 1999 and 2000 due to Vladimir Putin's well-known rise to the power in the Kremlin. Then I want to remind you that Belarus is the only country in Europe that still passes and carries out death sentences, while it is not a member of the Council of Europe. And all this in the European Union and in Northern America went by and large unnoticed. Belarus was and remained for a long time some kind of a terra incognita, and only very small circles of politicians, political scientists, some historians and economists paid attention to events in Belarus. Although, well, everybody knows it is a totally European country. This is not, I don't know, Southern America or Central Africa. Minsk is 1.5 hours by aircraft, of course, if you're not being intercepted by a jet fighter, from Vienna, where I'm now. 1.5 hours. This is, well, very close. And this state of affairs changed, at least to a certain extent, only last summer, in August 2020, when Mr. Lukashenko's rigging of the presidential elections became all too obvious. But he, however, he kept his power using in a very harsh way his security forces, meaning especially the Ministry of the Interior and the KGB, the Committee for State Security, which has not even changed its name since Soviet times. I mean, it is Committee for State Security has been renamed or dissolved or reformed somehow in all the other former Soviet republics, even in Russia, but not in Belarus. It is still the KGB. And using these security agencies, Lukashenko has, by and large, crushed the resistance of democratic-minded people who wanted Svetlana Tikhanovskaya to become the next president of Belarus. But as everybody knows, she's in exile, and I do not think that she will, in the near future, has any perspective to return to Belarus as president. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you. Thank you for that excellent introduction. It's very valuable for us to be reminded of the background, because as you say, it can't make sense of everything, but it certainly prepares us to try to make sense of things. And you brought us up very nicely to Sławek Sierakowski, who, as some of you will know, was one of the very few Western reporters who was actually in Minsk in August and September of last year to report. He was in Minsk for several weeks. What I'd like Sławek to do is to give us a sense of the importance of the young man who was arrested, Roman Protasevich, and the importance of his network that he worked for at the time, Nechta, and perhaps give us a sense of how these events will be grasped by the Belarusian opposition. So Sławek, the word is yours.
Thank you very much. Next, our Nechta, as we say in Russian, was absolutely crucial and still is, because they resides in Warsaw. Nobody switched off their internet, and they were much safer, at least at the time, during protests, and they were guiding protests. This is the most basic answer. The real organizers of protests were the people. This was actually leaderless movement. So even when Tikhanovskaya was captured and also forced to give a statement nobody expected any other behavior from KGB, so nobody was blaming her as now nobody's blaming Protasevich. It's a standard job, everybody knows it in the East. But the people were knowing where to go, what to do, how to behave, what's the danger, because of the daily routine that on the daily basis we were getting from Nexta. That means that, well, it was literally like a plan of the day. 2 o'clock we gather on the main squares, then we move to the like here or there, and like, so when you saw every Sunday 200,000 people, and they knew where to go, it was exactly because Nexta coordinated it, and they were using very appealing style. Their messages were very hot. There were even some controversies that the people residing in Warsaw are like coordinating all these protests. Actually, no one really wanted to be. I know that even today nobody believes that a group of young 20 years old guys could coordinate such a mass protest, but this was the truth, and this was kind of a mystery of this and the powerful side of it. Now we see that the controversies didn't make sense because they were risking a lot, as we know now, but they were collecting thousands of informations, trying to verify them, and then selecting them and channeling them. Nexta at the time, maybe still is, the largest Telegram channel in the world. They were running also YouTube channels, etc., etc. They were extremely active, and they were having responsibility, which was like huge and really unbelievable. So they are valuable for Lukashenko because of 2 or 3 reasons. One is revenge. Lukashenko is very emotional, and Lukashenko knows who did it to him. And Nexta is like top next to 3 leaders is probably the next person to be to express Lukashenko's revenge. So this is to address. The second thing is context. Lukashenko knows, Lukashenko assumes that Nexta, the Protasevich, knows everybody in Belarus, activists, journalists, everybody who can be dangerous for the regime. Of course, I mean, people in Belarus are smart, disciplined, so it doesn't mean that people were sending pictures, messages, everything with their names. And also Nexta, this group of people, they are smart people, so they also did not want to know much, but at least Lukashenko, as a control freak, paranoid, assumes that they know everything. And of course, this is to scare others, and to prove that everybody can be captured, even them. Is an example. Probably, and here Russia plays a certain role. So, like, more or less, this would be the shortest possible answer. Okay. Just one maybe to add one thing. Nexta was publishing also lists of functionaries. BIPOL, the organization of former militiamen or like other functionaries and plus hackers that are very active. IT sector in Belarus produced 6% of IT. They are great in IT technologies. Hackers were doing great job in collecting addresses, names, and then it was Nexta that posted it. So again, many people in this apparatus really wanted to capture Protasevich or Stepan, who is another leader of Nexta, and you can imagine like what's the danger for him now.
Thank you, Slavik. That was beautifully concise and clear, and you've you've given us a sense of why Roman Protasevich is so important, both for Belarusians and, of course, for converse reasons for the regime. Viktoras, I wonder if you could pick up at that point. You've had a lot of direct contact yourself with important Belarusian activists who have had to leave the country since late 2020. And you're speaking from the perspective of Lithuania. So I wonder if you could say something about how this has been received for Belarusian opposition, what it means to them. And if you could also move on and begin to speak a bit about the Lithuanian reaction, the social reaction, and also the reaction of the Lithuanian state to these events. So Viktoras.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I think the first thing to note is that although this event kind of attracted the attention of the West, but this is not a renewal of repressions. This is just a simple continuation since August 2020. And it was kind of, I think it's fair to say, in the West, it was off the radar. The Belarus was almost forgotten. I think it's fair to say. So now someone might think that it was all calm and suddenly Lukashenko woke up from his winter sleep. That's not the case. 3 days ago, Vytautas Ashurak died in prison. There was an attack on Tudbai, which is the largest news portal in Belarus last week. This continues basically non-stop since September. I think it's worth reminding people who don't follow that all the candidates, potential candidates who expressed intent to run against Lukashenko, they're still in prison. Tikhanovsky, Babariko's son is the chief of staff of Babariko is there. So, and this continued during the active phase of protests in autumn, thousands of people detained. And so this is nothing new. I think it's important to say, especially in the West, that it's just a continuation. This leads me to another important aspect is that after every presidential election, or basically after every election in Belarus, those who observe probably will say, it's fair to say that there's always some form of protest, because only the first election of Lukashenko, which he won, was acknowledged as fair and fairly won. The rest were basically stolen from the people. So there's always some phase of protest in Belarus. And it seems that this last wave of protest is continuing longer than usual. It is I think for analysts and for experts to decide, does it mean anything? And if it means what does it mean? But we almost 9 months into a form of protest. And if, let's say, observers in August and September were saying that this will die out and the leaders of opposition are weak, they're not politically qualified. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is not even a politician. So this will dissipate and evaporate. I think it's a good moment to acknowledge that it hasn't. It seems that opposition is here to stay. These leaders, they have shown resilience and they continue to fight. First and foremost, I mean, of course, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and her team, but also Pavel Latushko, and also, I mean, the remaining part of Babariko's team, and also Telegram channels. And now we are mentioning Nechta, but there's others. And to think that if you arrest Roman Protasevich, that you suddenly stop Telegram channels, even Lukashenko is not that stupid. There's no chance. First of all, there's not one channel. Of course, Nechta is extremely important, I agree, but it's not essential, if you will, because the risks are shared among other opposition activists. And so moving on to Lithuania, Lithuania is clearly trying to take up leadership in this new situation after the hijacking. Clearly, it was shocked as anybody, but more shocked probably than others, because the majority of the passengers were Lithuanian citizens. So it wasn't that Roman Protasevich was kidnapped. There were 100+ people who were kidnapped forcefully, moved to Minsk. Majority, 90+ of them were Lithuanian citizens, and so clearly Lithuanian government is trying to take up leadership within the EU. They made a communique yesterday or even on Sunday. Sorry, there's so many events, but I think it's unprecedented. It's communicated as the position of Lithuanian Republic, which is I've never seen anything like that. So it's clearly coordinated between the president and the prime minister and the minister of foreign affairs. It has 10 points or kind of a roadmap of what needs to be done and what it's clear they will be proposing to European and transatlantic partners. However, I have to say that me personally, I like the resolute tone of that list, but once again, the sanctions which are proposed, they are symmetrical sanctions. So they're proposing now to punish everyone or persons and organizations which were involved in this particular incident. And as we know already, Belarusian aviation company was already sanctioned, but I think it doesn't touch Lukashenko at all. So if we speak about sanctions, if they will work, they have to hurt. And for Lukashenko, what will hurt is sanctions on the industry, which is still owned mainly by the state, on the big industrial factories in Belarus, like Maz, MTZ, and others. That's the source of income for the country, and that's how he keeps paying the wages of OMON, KGB, and others. So I think it has to be reconsidered. I'll stop here for the moment.
Okay. Vytautas, thank you. Thank you very much. François Helsbourg, you're a leading strategist. I'm hoping that you can help us put these issues into a couple of larger perspectives. First of all, can you give us a sense of, from a strategic perspective, how unusual or norm-breaking this particular incident is, what it actually means from a strategic point of view? And then secondly, could you follow up on Viktoras's remarks by giving us a broader sense of whether you believe the European response is sensible and strategically adequate? And if you could say a word towards the end also about Belarusian-Russian military cooperation, I think that would also be helpful. So a big agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. First of all, I'm glad you asked the precedent-setting question, if I can put it that way. It is truly, at least for the last 65 years, I haven't found an equivalent precedent. 65 years ago, the French Air Force intercepted a Moroccan airliner with the leadership of the Algerian rebellion on board. About half of the top leadership was hijacked. That's a true equivalent, and it's the only one that I could find. And of course, in those days, air travel didn't have quite the importance that it has today in terms of the functioning of the planet. The assumption until the Minsk thing happened was that if you travel from Europe to Japan and you're not a friend of the Russian government or of the Chinese government, you were not running a risk. The Chicago Convention of 1944 and so on is very, very clear. And everybody was assuming that particular part of the fabric of globalization was here to stay. Well, now we know that a very, very big knife cut has been made into that fabric. So that's an importance which is added on to the other important aspects of this affair, the fate of a man, the fate of the opposition of a country, and so on. But this is a really big thing. Europe. Good news, bad news. The good news, and indeed to some extent surprising news, is that it only took 24 hours for the European Union to come up with a pretty clear statement, which all 27 were able to sign on to, and which is not exactly anodyne. Belavia aircraft are not allowed into the European Union airspace. There are 19 countries in the European Union which were served by that airline. They will no longer be served by that airline. And of course, all European Union airlines are now forbidden from flying over Belarus. You may have seen the shot from the flight radar website, where you see a big black hole in the middle of the European airspace. And this black hole where there are no aircraft is Belarus. So this is not exactly anodyne. And it's pretty immediate. So that's the good news. The bad news is that we don't know whether it'll work. And the worst news is that chances are that it won't. And indeed, my own reaction yesterday was to try to convince some of my friends that we should actually be tougher, and that is to go for an interruption of land border commercial exchanges between Belarus and the European Union at the border of the three countries of the Union which abut on Belarus. That would have hurt the enterprises which have just been mentioned very, very severely. They're highly dependent on exports to the European Union, and they're highly dependent also on some of their inputs, for some of their inputs on the European Union. The real question now for the European Union is whether the people are ready to go one step further if this whole matter is not resolved. That is, the freeing of the person who was abducted, the freeing and the restoration of the freedom of movement of that person. If that doesn't happen, is the European Union ready to go further? Another point on the European Union. What made, I think, the European Union act promptly by any standards was the notion that this was truly European. A European registered airline. Actually, I think it's actually the most important airline in terms of the number of the passengers flown by a European airline in European airspace. From one European Union capital to another European Union capital, and I think all of the passengers on board were, but I don't think any of them were American, if I can put it that way. So this was a truly European affair, and if we were going to fail, it wouldn't be possible to hide behind the Americans for our failure. Strategic autonomy wasn't going to go very far if you couldn't even stand up to Mr. Lukashenko. That has played a role. On Russia, on your last question, Russia, Belarus. whatever may have been the political permutations in Belarus since the breakup of the Soviet Union 30 years ago, Russia never ceased to enjoy a specific relationship with Belarus in the defense arena, in terms of the installations necessary for air defense and in terms of the installations necessary for anti-missile defenses, including those which protect Moscow. And that will remain a prime consideration for whatever happens next. And I'm sure Fiona will have a few things to say there. Otherwise, the important thing, of course, for Russia is also to be able to threaten Ukraine from the north if necessary. And indeed, in the recent standoff between Russia and Ukraine with the 120 or 130,000 Russian soldiers primed at one point to be able to move from Crimea, from the Rostov area and from Belarus into Ukraine. Well, Belarus was part of that, notwithstanding, of course, Lukashenko's refusal to endorse the annexation of Crimea and so forth. Just if I may come back for 1 second on the air ban, the EU decision. One of the problems of the EU decision is that it hits ordinary Belarusian citizens more than it actually hits the assets of the ruling clique. And travelers from Belarus to Western Europe will now have to either go by road or rail or take a plane from Moscow, if I can put it that way. I'm not sure that is a politically particularly desirable outcome as compared to other options. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francois, and thank you for bringing us right up to the central question that I have the pleasure of being able to ask Fiona Hill, which is, how does this look from the perspective of immediate and middle term Russian aims? And then for me, the $10,000 question at the moment, and people have already staked out positions on both sides, and I'm going to share mine before this is all over. Do we think, or do we think, and how do we think Russia was apprised and involved in this? And insofar as we think Russia may bear some responsibility, would it also be appropriate to consider including Russia in European or American policy responses? So Fiona, the voice is yours.
Thanks so much, Tim, and it's great to be part of this panel. I've learned a lot already from listening to all of our colleagues, and I'm sure that Ivan is going to sum it all up perfectly at the end. I wanted to pick up just where Francois left off, because, I mean, we really can't disentangle Belarus from Russia at this particular point. So, whether, Vladimir Putin was informed or, kind of gave an order on this, or was, he and his team were part of the planning, is in some respects almost immaterial, because Belarus and Russia have that, what was a symbolic union treaty, and has become, increasingly much more real. And there are many reasons why that's the case. And one of them is because of Lukashenko's own personal predicament right now. So I'm not saying it's completely irrelevant whether they did this, but the point is Belarus and Russia are becoming part of a continuum. There's many different reasons for this. One is not just what Francois said about the air defense and some of the other military aspects. You've got to also remember that Belarus is the land corridor for supply to Kaliningrad. And I'm sure Francois was going to think of that and has immediately thought of it now that I've said it. But, Belarus is the only link to Kaliningrad, which puts Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia in very awkward positions as well, because that exclave, even though it was once Germany and Königsberg, is critical for Russia's position on the Baltic Sea and Russia's overall strategic perspective in Europe. And when, I and many of my other colleagues who spend all our time worrying about, kind of what could the Russians do next, it's always been something with Belarus linked to Kaliningrad, risks to Kaliningrad, fears that they would be cut off for air supply or sea routes to Kaliningrad. And it always meant that Belarus, just like Ukraine, was always going to be in the Russian crosshairs. And I think, François is also right that, of course, Belarus puts a pincer movement and more pressure on Ukraine from the north. So in a military sense, Belarus is always part of Russian strategic thinking in Europe. And, also, keeping Belarus away from any kind of association with Europe, with NATO, or even closer relations with the United States. But I want to put into perspective also, Malek reminded us at the very beginning of this long history of Lukashenko being in power for 27 years. But, we've also now, a year and a half, 2 years ago, 2019, the technocrats in the Belarusian government, some of who have also died rather mysteriously now, or unfortunately, like Oleg Kravchenko, the deputy foreign minister, who was about to become the ambassador to the United States, were coming to people like me when I was in the administration and to trying to push out Belarus's relationships, not just with Europe, but also with the United States, to try to find some room for maneuver away from Russia. At that point, 2 years ago in 2019, Lukashenko didn't want to be wedded to Putin. He was trying to find a way out. And he was trying to find a way out precisely through those state industries that have been mentioned so many times, to try to get European and US investors, if possible, in them. And as preposterous it might seem now, Belarus had actually suggested hosting the annual conference of the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, in Minsk. They were throwing their lot in, so it seemed, with Europe and the West. What changed? The election, as everybody said, the opposition. The fact that what Lukashenko had done with his technocrats wasn't sufficient to win over, in a real sense, the population. They wanted something else. They didn't want Lukashenko for another 27 years. And of course, this all happens just as Putin's own opposition in Russia is starting to pick up. So Navalny's poisoning is also linked to what is going on in Belarus, because Vladimir Putin just last year amended the constitution, just like we heard from Martin that Lukashenko did it years back, to enable himself to, if he wants to, or if the system wants him, stay in power theoretically to 2036, by which time he'll have exceeded where Lukashenko is now. If Lukashenko was removed by the opposition, this is again very similar also to Venezuela with Nicolas Maduro, frankly, and Guaido and the whole thing that we saw playing out in Venezuela a couple of years ago. But if Lukashenko had been successfully removed, both in the election, which he obviously was, and then by the oppositions, what message would that be for Putin, who at one point was actually thinking about preserving himself in power and influence through this Belarusian-Russian union, and by maybe setting up a new privy council or some superstructure as well, all this kind of machination behind the scenes. So Lukashenko's removal would have been disastrous for Putin. And at the same time that all of the protests are taking place in Minsk and elsewhere, Alexei Navalny is running around in the Urals and in Siberia, whipping up similar kinds of opposition. And Navalny gets poisoned. At the same time this is all happening, and there's also separate but interrelated opposition activity going on in places like Khabarovsk, opposing Putin and others' efforts to put in their own people in far-flung provinces in Russia, and upturning kind of local interest in politics. So all of this has collided together. So Protasevich is essentially like Navalny, and what we've seen is that Lukashenko has had to run now towards Russia, has had to abandon the technocratic idea of, balancing off with Europe, and he's thrown in his lot with Moscow. So he's obviously also abandoned his technocrats, because they've all sort of disappeared from the scene as well. My theory was that they had promised him that they would show some success in the elections, that by opening up Belarus, having this EBRD and other kind of major reform program, they thought that they would kind of buy support from the population. It didn't work. That's a very chilling message to Putin and to others as well watching this. And, we can also, I think, put what's happened in the same bracket as what we've just seen in Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia and Azerbaijan. And I think, Ivan may have something to say on this as well. Because Putin had wanted to show Nikol Pashinyan a lesson. Because Pashinyan came into power in Armenia against the backdrop of a grassroots opposition movement, overturning the old system that had been favored to some degree by Moscow because they could manipulate them. And Pashinyan was trying to kind of go out there, branch out on his own. And, basically Aliyev seems to have gone to Moscow, becoming increasingly frustrated by not being able to resolve Nagorno-Karabakh diplomatically, and decides to throw his lot in with Moscow to, basically get a chance to take back the occupied territories of Nagorno-Karabakh that Armenia has been sitting on since, again, 1994, since Lukashenko came into power. Aliyev had a bit more room for maneuver because he had Turkey that he'd invested in over time, brought Turkey in, kind of gave themselves a bit of room for maneuver in Nagorno-Karabakh vis-a-vis Russia, but Lukashenko doesn't have that. Lukashenko doesn't have Turkey, doesn't have Europe, he just has himself. And so now I think what Lukashenko is trying to do is create some room for maneuver, I'm afraid to say, by eliminating the opposition. And also showing to Moscow that he can do, so he may not have actually coordinated this with Moscow, because it might be showing Moscow how audacious he can be. Because the last thing Lukashenko wants to be is just with Putin, and Putin doing a Pashinyan on him, or what Putin might have done with Yanukovych, for example. All he's got is Putin, and Putin could easily prop him up and then have him removed. So Lukashenko is fighting for his life, and he's going to keep on doing outrageous things. And, I hate to say that nothing, getting back to what François said, is probably going to shake Protasevich out of Lukashenko's grip. And this is like Skripal, this is like the shooting down of MH17. It's all the kind of brazen acts that we have to respond to now, to saying, okay, we see what you're doing, and we're not going to permit you to do this at your expense. And I think what Viktoras said about the fact that 100 plus Lithuanian citizens were taken hostage, just like the citizens of a whole myriad of countries, from Malaysia to the United States to the Netherlands, were killed by MH17. In Skripal, a British citizen, Dawn Sturgis, was killed. We cannot allow these things to happen. And so I think we have to come down really hard, but knowing full well that this will be absolutely terrible for the citizens of Belarus, who are completely, opposed to all of this themselves, but also that Lukashenko has nothing but Putin to fall back on. And that's kind of what he's doing. He's trying to fight now for his survival domestically, but also so that Putin doesn't just completely decide what to do with him next.
Okay, thank you very much, Fiona. Ivan, I've left you the task of picking up the points that you'd like to pick up and adding any, if you'd like, concluding and synthetic remarks. And then we'll have a few minutes left at the end for questions. A couple of themes have emerged in the questions, so I will give everybody a shot at those major themes. Before we do that, Ivan Krastev, we're looking forward to you.
Thank you very much. And the colleagues were very articulate and clear, so there is nothing for me to sum up. I just want to make 3 points very much going in the same direction that François and Fiona were going. One is that Mr. Lukashenko was playing a difficult game over these years. He had a much more Tito mind. He was trying to convince the Belarusians that he's only guarantee for the sovereignty of the country, playing West against Russia, Russia against the West. And even on the last presidential elections, he was much more talking about Russian interference than the Western interference. This is over. In a certain way, it was a regime change. And what we know for sure is that Russia is totally determined to keep Belarus in its sphere of influence. What we don't know is, are they totally determined to keep Mr. Lukashenko where he is? And if you remember, 2 months ago, there was this major scandal, a talk in Moscow. 2 Belarusian opposition figures have been arrested to talk about a coup. Lukashenko is going to be killed. His son is going to be killed. So from this point of view, I'll not be surprised that even the Russians are surprised for what happened, because in a strange way, Mr. Lukashenko is making the cost of his removal now symbolically high for Moscow. Because if Lukashenko is going to be removed now, it means that it was under Western pressure. So this is his own way to play for himself. And by the way, the fact that there is a Russian citizen, the girlfriend of the arrested leader, it's also not good for Russia. And to be honest, Russians, they don't hijack planes. They have a well-developed chemical industry, as we know recently, so probably they know how they can eliminate people without going on a major airplanes. But on European side, I do believe, of course, François is very much right, that there was a very quick reaction, and in European case, this is always something to be admired. But I do believe we still have an opportunity to show something different. I cannot see why European Union cannot declare that we're going to give 10,000 fellowships to the Belarusian kids going to come to study in Europe starting from September. I cannot see why we're not going to say that we're ready to vaccinate Belarusians who are going to come to Europe. From this point of view, and this is my only point, what we should be afraid of is that the interest of both Lukashenko, but also Russia, to close the country should not be done with our hands. in a certain way, I'm strongly much more for asymmetrical response. We are very predictable, unfortunately, as a foreign policy player. And I do believe that if we're going to come with a major initiative, also declaring that there are going to be easy registration for the Belarusian IT companies in the EU capitals and others, this is going to create much more disruption in the system than simply going on. And keeping in mind, this is my last point, our sanctions with not flying over Belarus, I do believe it's just the moment of days when the Russia is going to say that this is bad for climate. Because now the planes are flying kind of a longer time. Thank you.
Okay, Ivan. Well, if they hadn't thought of it yet, now they've got it. So we can look forward to that. Thank you very much for those remarks, which lead very nicely both to some of the themes in the questions and to the way I wanted to sum up those questions. So I'd like to ask, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. I'd like to ask all the panelists, and just nod your head if you want a response, if you want to respond, about the sense of these sanctions. And I mean this from 4 different points of view. Number one, if, as Fiona Hill says, we have to consider analytically Russia and Belarus to be one unit, shouldn't we then be thinking creatively about who we are sanctioning here? Does it really make sense to keep the sanctions limited to the Belarusian state? The second point, which was made by 2 or 3 panelists, is the Belarusian population. And I want to extend that point. I would have thought it would be in the Western interest to have Belavia fly more flights rather than fewer flights. I would have thought that it was in our interest to have more Belarusians have contact with the West rather than fewer. And it seems like, in a way, you could understand the European sanctions as a plank in the platform, I'm being provocative here, of the Belarusian-Russian Union state, because it does mean that, for lack of other options, Belarusians are going to be traveling more to Russia. I think we've strengthened Russia's hand here in cultural and social terms. And the third thing I wanted to make here, and this follows, I'm just repeating Ivan really, is that this was totally predictable. I mean, you don't have to be, it doesn't have to be a classic example of Russian, reflexive response to just note that we did exactly what was going to be what they would have predicted. And when I tweeted about it right afterwards, I said, this is what the Europeans are going to do, and this is what they did. And it's not just that predictability in itself is kind of a problem. It's also that I'm afraid it gives the Europeans a sense of like, oh, we've done the right thing. Like, we've checked the box. Like, this was about air travel. Our sanctions are about air travel. No one can say we did anything irresponsible. But if what we do is so utterly predictable that the Russian TV hosts already have their jokes written about it ahead of time, right? Which is the case. If what we do is that predictable, is that not a problem for us? And so then my question would be, like, again with Ivan, would it make sense to have a response which is not a negative response, but which is a positive response, where we're actually reaching out some way? So, and then, and as we think about how, this first round of sanctions might change, we should also think about, as one of the audience members mentioned, what we do when Protasevich, God forbid, appears to be hurt or is killed, right? I mean, because one outcome is that he's released. That's one possible outcome, but there's another possible outcome, which is that we never see him again, or that something worse than that happens. So there's a bag of questions here having to do with sanctions, which Fiona Hill, in a very subtle way, is suggesting to me that she would like to take a crack at answering.
No, I actually want to clarify something, because I think, when I was saying something to be provocative in the way that I was posing things, but I do think that what Ivan said at the very end, and I think that, bringing in Slavek and Viktoras on this as well is important. We don't want to lose Belarusian sovereignty or the sovereignty of the people. So what I was kind of putting it in this harsh light, I was thinking about the Union Treaty and Lukashenko himself. And I think we should always, if we can, I think Lukashenko is very isolated, actually, because look, he just got rid of half his technocrats as well, who had bought into this while he was doing something. So I think about the now deceased Kravchenko, who I thought was a very sincere person in my many, many meetings with him over all the years from when he was in the embassy here. They were seriously trying to do something. I mean, he's literally dead now. And I don't know whether it was a natural heart attack. He was a young man. And, many other of those people have disappeared too. Like in Russia, at a different point, there were many people trying to put the regime, Lukashenko, frankly, on a different path, and they've failed. So it's not just the opposition coming up from the street. There were people in the system trying to change things. And I'm sure they would still like to see some change. So I think something along the lines of what Ivan was saying, and I'm sure that Viktoras and Slavek have also got some ideas, from that outside as well about what we could do. Because it shouldn't be that we abandon Belarusian sovereignty. Just because Lukashenko's decided to do it, he's not even like General Jaruzelski. He's given up on the sovereignty because it's just like exactly what was happening in Nagorno-Karabakh, where Aliyev gave up on the thing he said he would never do, letting the Russian peacekeepers in, although he managed to get the Turks in, because he wanted more than anything to have some success in Nagorno-Karabakh. And as a result, kind of both Armenia and Azerbaijan, in my view, got sold down the river. But this is what Lukashenko's done. He sold Belarus, the country, his people, down the river to save his own personal skin.
Okay, thank you, Fiona. I'm glad you were the first to respond because I know you have a hard deadline. We may take a few minutes. We may go a few minutes over 60 minutes. So I just want to make sure I thank you before you go. François is keen to respond too.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim. Tim, you said that there were several possibilities, and one is that we would not see the person abducted again. That is unfortunately true. And that also means that it's extremely difficult at this stage to play a positive asymmetric response. Like, oh, if you give him back to us, we will extend the 10,000 fellowships to Belarusian students. That would be a bit awkward. Probably wouldn't help him. And worse than that, it may actually hurt him. Ursula von der Leyen actually hinted at an asymmetric response when she said yesterday that if Belarus becomes a normal European country, we have I forgot what was the number, whether it was a 20 billion or 30 billion package ready for Belarus. Well, yes, sure. But for the moment, we want to secure the release and obviously the survival of the person who has been abducted. That's very tricky. But I share what you said, Tim, and what Ivan have said also, etc., on the air response, if I can put it that way. We should be ready, and we should have been ready. But it's never too late to change one's mind. We should be ready to stop a Belarusian trade, and that which goes through the European Union, and that is a large share of the trade, and it's the trade which allows regime survival. And of course, it would also pose problems to Russia, even if Russia is not directly designated in diplomatic or political terms.
Okay, thank you. I think Ivan wanted to jump in, and then maybe Viktoras and
just one sentence. I very much agree with François. It should not be that we are giving 10,000 fellowships for getting Roman out. I do believe it's something totally different. We're basically going to say we're not going to issue visa to anybody who is working in the security apparatus in Belarus, but at the same time. And in my view, and very much I'm on the same page with Fiona, if we try to look at Russia and Belarus as a union state, then we're going to contribute basically to destroying the sovereignty of Belarus. And I don't believe we should do it.
No.
Very good. Okay, Martin Malek has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Timothy. As to your question, whether it would be possible to apply some positive response. This is, I think it's very important because it points to a very complicated issue. How is it possible, or whether it is possible at all, to somehow punish the regime and not to punish the Belarusian population, and not to punish, of course, the people who were on the streets for several months in order to express their dissatisfaction with the Lukashenko regime. Of course, I do not think that anybody will object to more fellowships for Belarusian students, and you have even, so to speak, a Belarusian opposition university in Vilnius for a long time. But let me raise another question. What would happen if no action is taken at all after this brazen hijacking of Roman Protasevich? I think it's a legitimate question, and this reminds me, I want to quote Anne Applebaum, who wrote yesterday in the Atlantic, quote, other regimes will hijack planes too, meaning if nothing is been done. If Belarus gets away with it, authoritarian regimes around the world will have a new tool of oppression, unquote. I think we should keep this in mind. The worst thing to do is to remain passive. Well, already yesterday, the European Union has taken a first step with the sanctions we have already discussed. I mean, blocking the European airspace for Belarusian civil aircraft. But in the interest of the Belarusian people, who certainly wants freedom, I have no doubt about that. In the interest of the Belarusian people, it would be bad to stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give Sławek and Viktoras their say before we sign off. But before I do that, though, I want to extend Martin's remark by pointing out that there are other precedents that have been set that need to be considered. So a precedent has been set that a state can hijack a civilian airliner, and the sanctions and the European response, which I quite agree were necessary and rapid, they aim at that. But a couple of other things have happened. One other thing which has happened is that an air traffic controller has almost certainly knowingly lied to a pilot about a matter of life and death importance. So if that's not recognized and stigmatized, you're going to be in a world where pilots aren't sure that they can listen to air traffic controllers because the air traffic controllers have lied to them. And relatedly, we are meant to have an anti-terrorist apparatus, which at least at some basic fundamental level involves trust between countries that might not otherwise get along. That apparatus was just abused. Code language was abused between Belarusian authorities and the pilot on the Ryanair flight to suggest that a terrorist attack was taking place. If we cannot trust one another about terrorism signals, then we are also making terrorism easier to carry out. So those are two other things which happened, and I think which have to be thought about when we think about the response and how important it is that this not become a precedent. Okay, Viktoras and Sławek, and then we're going to say goodbye to our patient listeners. Viktoras.
Yeah, okay. So I would like to say a few words about the sanctions. Somehow we turned into this debate into either or, as if we have to choose the punitive measures or what we call positive sanctions. But I think we need both. We need, I would term asymmetrical sanctions in the sense that the incident is with the airlines, but we shouldn't respond in terms of aviation. We should punish where it hurts. But also, of course, we need to work with the society. And what Ivan said, I think it's definitely should be done. It definitely should be done in conjunction with punishment. And also another thing, in order not to turn Belarusian society against yourself, you need to work with opposition. It's there. And don't assume that you know better than Belarusians what they need and what works. And last point, although it has been said, but the last thing we need is to throw Belarus with Russia in one basket. Russia, I'm pretty convinced, has stayed very reserved in the last wave of protest because it doesn't want to repeat the mistake which it made in Ukraine in overreaching and then turning population against itself. At the moment, all the polls show that the majority, 80% of Belarusians are against any state, any common state with Russia. So we can only we can make only a grave mistake if we start thinking about Belarus and Russia as one entity, because Belarusians themselves don't think that, even Russians themselves don't think that. So we have to be very careful about it.
Thank you. Okay, Sławek, you got the last word.
My general impression is that sanctions are to secure Europeans, and actually this map looks like this more than to secure Belarusians. Like the same map like turned me into like feeling like how Belarusians feel when they see the same map. Whereas we can feel certain satisfaction, but to be now in Minsk and to see that there is no way out, you feel like a hostage. I'm not sure if having more contacts now, and it's not a joke. As a child raised in the 80s, I can say that more contacts with like Russians and less with the West will produce rather the opposite reaction. Then, I mean, of course, in the long term, when you're talking about centuries, of course not. But when you're talking about geopolitics today, I'm not that sure. The other thing is like, I mean, I would welcome, and we did not discuss it. I would, and actually that nobody seems to discuss it. I would welcome more somehow rough methods from European Union. Not talking about like military issues or something like this, but like, I mean, bribing functionaries, supporting like local, like trying to get some contacts to like civil journalists. There are many of them in Belarus. So because you know the only condition if you want people to strike or to do anything is to somehow replace the state, providing them with economic welfare. Otherwise they won't strike because they're totally, plus their families, dependent on the state. This is what Lukashenko did for the last 27 years, building entire system of making you dependent and your family dependent, trying to cut these ties would make most sense. This is why you have all these funds. This infrastructure is built. It's not easy to finance it from outside, but I would welcome at least a discussion about it instead of just like, you know, most basic methods of sanctioning. Concerning sovereignty, I don't see much difference between like Belarusian sovereignty between Lukashenko and the opposition concerning like sovereignty from Russia. I mean, Lukashenko was very, very like smart and cheating. He was probably the only best cheater than Putin in the world, and he knows how to deal with Putin. And his first move, once he will recover, will be to stay out of and to defend, well, Belarusian sovereignty as he understands it from Russia. So, but of course, again, dealing with Lukashenko, giving him something, Poland tried to do it 2010. It didn't work. So I would go and first listen to some experts, like how to do it further, cooperating with hackers, local people, giving fellowships, but not drenching people, but trying to help people inside Belarus. This would be something that it's like.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Sławek. Thank you very much to all of you. I mean, if I could summarize these last few remarks, I think it's been very helpful for us to be reminded that however surprised we might be and however imperfect our response might be, there is this longer term question of the Belarusian opposition and the Belarusian opposition and the Belarusian population. And so whatever we're doing when we're thinking about Europeans or when we're thinking about larger strategic questions, we should make sure that we have the Belarusian opposition and the Belarusian population in mind, and that whatever we're doing is consistent with some kind of plan for a future which has something to do with their own desires and wishes. Again, all of you, thank you very much for your clarifying remarks from all of these various directions. Very grateful. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure the public has as well. Thank you.